The code blue alarm shattered the 2 a.m. quiet. Doctors sprinted toward room 314. But the elevator was broken and the stairs were being cleaned. The young resident leading the team slipped on the wet floor and cut her hand badly on the metal bucket. As she stared at the blood, the janitor knelt beside her, examined the wound, and spoke words that changed everything. You'll need 12 stitches, but no tendon damage. Welcome to Untold Valor Stories. Before we dive into this incredible tale of hidden expertise and unexpected revelation, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who serve in ways we never see. St. Mary's General Hospital never truly slept, even at 2 a.m., when the corridors dimmed to emergency lighting, and the daytime chaos gave way to the quieter rhythms of night shift rotations. The building hummed with life. Monitors beeped in patient rooms, nurses padded softly between stations, and somewhere in the depths of the building, machines breathed for people who couldn't breathe for themselves. Michael David Thompson, though everyone just called him Mike, had been part of this nighttime ecosystem for 5 years, 3 months, and 12 days. Not that anyone was counting except Mike himself, who had developed a habit of marking time in precise increments, since his world had changed so dramatically that precision was the only thing that kept him grounded. He arrived every evening at 10:47 p.m., exactly 13 minutes before his shift officially began. Those 13 minutes were sacred time, a ritual that prepared him for 8 hours of invisibility. He'd change into his gray maintenance uniform, a locker room, that smell of industrial disinfectant and tired dreams, check his supplies, and mentally map out his route through the hospital's 7 floors. The night shift suited him. During the day, St. Mary's was a symphony of controlled chaos, doctors rushing between surgeries, nurses coordinating complex care plans, families filling waiting rooms with hope and fear in equal measure. But at night, the hospital became something different, quieter, more thoughtful, the kind of place where a man could disappear into routine and find something resembling peace. Mike's territory covered the cardiac wing on the 4th floor, the surgical recovery units on the 3rd, and the general medical floors on the 2nd. He knew every room, every corner, every place where dust gathered or equipment got forgotten. He could clean around sleeping patients without waking them, mop floors without leaving streaks, and maintain perfect order in a world that specialized in controlled disorder. The night staff knew him the way they knew the coffee machine in the break room, or the temperamental elevator that took 30 seconds too long to respond. He was part of the infrastructure, reliable and unnoticed. Dr. Sarah Chen, a second-year resident in cardiology, had passed him in the hallways hundreds of times over the past year. She'd seen him cleaning the break room at 3 a.m. when she grabbed coffee during marathon shifts. She'd watched him quietly empty trash cans during code blue emergencies, moving around the medical chaos like water flowing around stones. But she never really looked at him, never noticed the way he carried himself with a subtle straightness that suggested military training, never observed how his movements, even while pushing a mop bucket, maintained an economy of motion that spoke of precise training, never saw how his eyes constantly scanned rooms not for dirt or disorder, but with the systematic awareness of someone who'd been trained to assess and analyze. Mike preferred it that way. Invisibility was safety, anonymity was peace. For 5 years, he found solace in being nobody special, just another night shift worker in a hospital full of heroes and heartbreak. He lived alone in a studio apartment, 6 blocks from the hospital, close enough to walk to work but far enough to feel separate from the world he'd left behind. The apartment was sparse: a bed, a small table, 2 chairs, and a bookshelf filled with medical journals he'd never thrown away. His most treasured possession was a framed photograph that sat on his nightstand, showing a younger version of himself in surgical scrubs, surrounded by a team of nurses and residents after completing a particularly challenging heart surgery. Dr. Michael Thompson, cardiothoracic surgery chief resident. That's who he'd been 7 years ago. That's who he trained 15 years to become. That's who he'd been until one moment of human error had changed everything. Every morning before sleep, he'd look at that photograph for exactly 30 seconds, long enough to remember who he'd been, not long enough for the memories to overwhelm him. Then he'd close his eyes and try not to dream about the steady beep of heart monitors and the weight of other people's lives in his hands. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd chosen to stay in a hospital. His therapist, back when he'd still believed therapy might help, had suggested he find work completely unrelated to medicine, a clean break, she'd called it. Give yourself permission to be someone entirely new. But Mike had discovered that running from medicine was like trying to run from breathing. It was too much a part of who he was, so instead of fleeing, he found a way to stay close to the world he'd lost while remaining safely invisible within it. He could still help people, even if they never knew he was helping. He could still be part of healing, even if his contribution was measured in clean floors and empty trash cans rather than saved lives and mended hearts. The other night shift workers had long since stopped trying to make conversation. Mike was polite but distant, professional but unreachable. He did his job with quiet competence. Never complained, never called in sick, never created drama or conflict. He was the ideal employee in every way except the most human one. He never let anyone get close enough to know who he really was. Tuesday night, November 3rd, had been typical until 1:47 a.m. Mike was cleaning the cardiac wing, moving methodically from room to room, when the first sign of trouble arrived in room 314. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, a 73-year-old woman recovering from cardiac bypass surgery, began showing signs of arrhythmia on her monitors. The overnight charge nurse, Patricia Williams, noticed the irregular readings during her hourly rounds and immediately called for Dr. Chen, who was covering the cardiac unit along with 2 other residents spread thin across the hospitals. Nighttime eased out by 15 a.m. Mrs. Vasquez's condition had deteriorated rapidly. Her heart rhythm became increasingly erratic, her blood pressure dropped, and her oxygen saturation began to fall despite supplemental oxygen. Dr. Chen made the decision to call a code blue a hospital-wide alert. That brought emergency response teams running. The problem was that St. Mary's was in the middle of a maintenance cycle. The main elevator was shut down for repairs that had been delayed for 3 months due to parts availability. The emergency elevator was operational but located on the opposite side of the building, from the cardiac wing and the central stairwell, which would normally provide the fastest access to the 4th floor, was blocked due to a cleaning project that involved stripping and refinishing the stairs with a non-slip coating. When the code blue alarm sounded at 2:03 a.m., Dr. Chen was already in the room with Mrs. Vasquez, but she needed immediate backup. The emergency response team, led by Dr. James Martinez, an emergency medicine attending, would have to take the long route through the hospital's maze-like layout to reach the cardiac wing. Mike heard the alarm from 3 rooms away, where he was quietly cleaning around a sleeping patient. Code blues were part of the hospital's rhythm, dramatic punctuation marks in the steady flow of nighttime care. Usually, he simply moved his equipment out of the way and continued working once the medical teams had rushed past. But something about this particular alarm felt different. He could hear the urgency in the hurried footsteps, the sharp edge of concern in voices carrying down the hallway. Through the partly open door of room 314, he could see Dr. Chen working alone with Mrs. Vasquez, checking monitors, adjusting equipment, trying to stabilize a patient whose condition was clearly critical. Mike continued his work, but his attention was divided now. Part of him was still Mike the janitor, focused on maintaining the careful invisibility that had become his survival strategy. But another part of him, the part he'd spent 5 years trying to suppress, was Dr. Thompson, automatically assessing the situation, reading the signs, understanding the stakes. When he heard Dr. Chen on the phone with the emergency team explaining the elevator situation and the blocked stairwell, Mike felt something stir in his chest. Something that felt uncomfortably like professional responsibility. How long until they get here? Dr. Chen was asking into the phone, her voice steady but tense. The answer, which Mike couldn't hear but could read in her expression, was clearly longer than Mrs. Vasquez could wait. Dr. Chen hung up the phone and returned to her patient. But Mike could see the calculation in her movements. She was a second-year resident, competent and well-trained. But this was the kind of situation that required experience she hadn't had time to accumulate. The kind of situation where seconds mattered and every decision carried life or death weight. Mike finished cleaning the room he was in and moved his cart closer to room 314. Not quite sure why he was drawn to a situation he had no business being involved in. He told himself he was just being cautious, making sure his equipment wouldn't be in the way when the emergency team finally arrived. But when Dr. Chen stepped out of the room to check on the emergency team's progress, she moved quickly toward the blocked stairwell, apparently hoping to guide them through the hospital's confusing layout. That's when everything changed. The stairs had been coated with a polymer treatment that was supposed to dry overnight, but remained slick in spots. Dr. Chen was moving fast, focused on the emergency upstairs rather than the wet floor beneath her feet. Mike saw what was about to happen a split second before it did. Her right foot hit a patch of uncured coating, her left foot tangled with Mike's cleaning bucket, which he'd positioned close to the stairs. She went down hard, her left hand striking the edge of the metal bucket with enough force to open a deep gash across her palm. The sound of her hitting the floor mixed with her sharp intake of breath and the clatter of the bucket overturning. Mike dropped his mop and was beside her in seconds, but not in the way a janitor might help someone who'd fallen. He moved with the swift, decisive motion of someone who'd spent years responding to medical emergencies. Dr. Chen sat on the floor, staring at her left hand, which was bleeding heavily. In the harsh fluorescent light of the stairwell, the wound looked deep and serious. Blood flowed between her fingers and dripped onto the white linoleum floor, mixing with the spilled cleaning solution. "Let me see," Mike said, kneeling beside her and gently taking her injured hand in both of his. Dr. Chen looked up at him, probably intending to say she was fine, that she can handle it herself. But when she met his eyes, something in his expression stopped her. There was an authority there, a calm competence that didn't match his janitor's uniform. Mike examined the wound with quick, gentle precision. His fingers probed the edges of the cut, assessing depth and damage with the confident touch of someone who'd evaluated thousands of injuries. After 10 seconds of careful examination, he looked directly at Dr. Chen. "You'll need 12 stitches, but no tendon damage," he said. "The bleeding looks worse than it is. Pressure and elevation will control it until you can get to emergency." Double quotes. Dr. Chen stared at him. The words he'd spoken weren't remarkable in themselves, but the way he'd spoken them was. The clinical assessment, the professional confidence, the casual use of medical terminology that suggested familiarity with trauma care. "How do you know that?" she asked. Mike realized what he'd just done. For 5 years, he'd been scrupulously careful to never reveal any medical knowledge, never offer any opinion that might suggest he was anything more than a cleaning man with a high school education. In one moment of instinctive response to an emergency, he'd blown his carefully constructed cover. He could have made something up, could have claimed he'd been an EMT, or had first aid training, or had just seen a lot of injuries working in a hospital, but something about the situation in emergency upstairs. The woman bleeding in front of him. The return of that familiar feeling of being needed in a medical crisis made lying feel impossible. Because I used to be a doctor, he said quietly. The words hung in the stairwell like something physical. Dr. Chen continued to stare at Mike, her mind trying to reconcile the man in gray maintenance uniform with the professional assessment he'd just delivered and the impossible claim he'd just made. You used to be a doctor, she repeated, not quite a question. Mike looked down at her hand, which was still bleeding despite the pressure he was applying. Mrs. Vasquez was still in crisis 3 floors above them. The emergency team was still trying to navigate the hospital's blocked routes. And now, he'd revealed the secret he'd protected for 5 years to a resident, who had every reason to think he was either lying or delusional. Dr. Michael Thompson, he said, meeting her eyes again. Cardiothoracic surgery. I worked here until 7 years ago. Dr. Chen's expression shifted from confusion to recognition. She'd heard that name before, though she couldn't immediately place where. It was familiar in the way that medical legends became familiar. Stories passed down through residents and nurses, names attached to procedures or outcomes that became part of hospital folklore. Thompson, she said slowly, the Thompson procedure for mitral valve repair. Mike nodded once. I developed that technique during my residency here. The Thompson procedure was still being used at St. Mary's. Dr. Chen had assisted on 3 surgeries. Where it had been employed, it was an elegant solution to a complex problem, a way of repairing damaged heart valves that reduced surgical time and improved patient outcomes. She'd always assumed it had been named after some famous surgeon from decades past, not after someone who might be mopping floors 3 doors away from where she worked. But if she began, then stopped. The questions were too big, too complicated for a stairwell conversation while she bled and Mrs. Vasquez needed emergency care. Mike seemed to understand her priorities. We need to get you to emergency and get someone up to 314, he said. Mrs. Vasquez doesn't have much time, doctor. Chen made a decision that surprised them both. Can you help her? Mike's expression went carefully neutral. I can't practice medicine. I'm not licensed anymore. I'm not asking you to practice. I'm asking if you can help. As a consultant, under my supervision, it was medically and legally questionable. But they both knew that Mrs. Vasquez's condition was deteriorating and the emergency team was still minutes away. Sometimes medicine required decisions that existed in gray areas between protocol and necessity. Mike looked at Dr. Chen's wounded hand, then toward the stairs that led to the cardiac wing, then back at her face. He saw determination there, and trust, and the kind of professional calculation that prioritized patient care over administrative convenience. Can you make it up the stairs? He asked. I can make it. Mike helped her to her feet, then retrieved a clean towel from his cart to wrap around her injured hand as they climbed the stairs together. He found himself automatically shifting back into medical mode, thinking through Mrs. Vasquez's case based on what he'd observed from the hallway. What's her presentation? He asked as they reached the 4th floor. Post-op day 3 from bypass surgery started with a regular rhythm around midnight, progressed to sustained VTach, blood pressures dropping, oxygen saturation falling despite supplemental O2. Mike nodded, his mind already working through differential diagnoses and treatment options. Any signs of fluid overload, chest pain, changes in her surgical sites, no fluid retention. She complained of chest discomfort earlier but attributed it to surgical pain. Incision sites looked clean. They reached room 314, where Mrs. Vasquez lay unconscious, her monitor showing a heart rhythm that had deteriorated further in the few minutes Dr. Chen had been away. Mike stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the full picture of the patient, the monitors, the medications already in use. For 5 years, he'd avoided situations exactly like this one. He'd walked past medical emergencies, ignored his instincts to help, suppressed every impulse to return to the work he trained his entire adult life to do. He convinced himself that his medical knowledge was dangerous, that his presence in clinical situations would do more harm than good. But looking at Mrs. Vasquez, seeing the critical nature of her condition, feeling the familiar weight of professional responsibility, Mike made a choice that surprised him. She's in cardiogenic shock, he said, stepping into the room. The arrhythmia is secondary. We need to address the underlying cardiac function. Dr. Chen looked at him with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. What do you recommend? Mike moved to the bedside, not quite touching the patient, but positioning himself where he could see all the monitors and assess the situation comprehensively. His mind shifted into the analytical mode he thought he'd lost forever, processing information with the speed and accuracy that had once made him one of the most promising cardiac surgeons in the state. She needs synchronized cardioversion, he said, but first we need to stabilize her blood pressure. Start dopamine at 5 micrograms per kilogram per minute. Get cardiology up here with a crash cart that has cardioversion capability. And check her electrolytes if her potassium or magnesium are off. The cardioversion won't hold. Dr. Chen was already moving, implementing his recommendations with the efficiency of someone who recognized sound medical judgment when she heard it. Labs backed up. It'll be 20 minutes for electrolytes. Then we treat empirically. Give her magnesium sulfate, 2 grams for push. If I'm wrong, it won't hurt her. If I'm right, it might save her life. As Dr. Chen prepared the medications, Mike found himself slipping back into the role he never really stopped being. He wasn't touching the patient directly. That would have crossed legal lines he couldn't afford to cross. but he was providing the kind of expert guidance that could mean the difference between life and death. Dr. Chen, he said quietly, watching the monitors, when the emergency team gets here, you're going to need to make a decision. You can tell them you had consultation from maintenance staff, or you can tell them you made these calls yourself. Either way, you'll need to be prepared to defend the treatment plan. She looked at him, understanding the weight of what he was saying. What would you do? I'd tell them the truth, but only if asked directly. The emergency team arrived 6 minutes later, led by Dr. Martinez and accompanied by 2 nurses and a respiratory therapist. They took in the scene Mrs. Vasquez stabilizing on dopamine, Dr. Chen coordinating care with her hand bandaged, and Mike standing quietly in the corner with his mop bucket. Status, Dr. Martinez asked Dr. Chen, post-op. Day 3 cardiac bypass, went into VTACH with cardiogenic shock. Started dopamine and magnesium per cardiology consultation, patients responding well. Dr. Martinez checked the monitors, examined the patient, and reviewed the medication orders. Everything was textbook perfect, exactly what he would have recommended. In the same situation, good work, he told Dr. Chen. Who was your cardiology consult? Dr. Chen hesitated for just a moment, then made her choice. Dr. Thompson, she said. He was available for phone consultation. Dr. Martinez nodded, satisfied with the explanation. The name Thompson carried enough weight in cardiology circles that the consultation made perfect sense. He had no reason to look more closely at the quiet man in maintenance uniform who was emptying trash cans. In the corner of the room, Mrs. Vasquez was stable within 30 minutes. The emergency team had successfully performed synchronized cardioversion, restoring her normal heart rhythm. Her blood pressure had normalized with the dopamine support, and her oxygen saturation had returned to acceptable levels. She would need close monitoring and probably some adjustment to her cardiac medications. But the immediate crisis had passed. Dr. Chen's hand required exactly 12 stitches. Just as Mike had predicted, the emergency department physician who treated her commented on the accuracy of the field assessment and asked if she'd had military medical training. She simply said she'd had good guidance. By 4 a.m., the hospital had returned to its quieter nighttime rhythm. The emergency team had dispersed to other duties. Mrs. Vasquez was sleeping comfortably under close monitoring, and the block stairwell had been reopened after the floor coating had finally cured. Mike had returned to his cleaning routine, working through the remaining floors on his schedule as if nothing unusual had happened. But something fundamental had shifted for the first time in 5 years. He'd practiced medicine again, not officially, not legally, but meaningfully. He'd made clinical decisions that had helped save a life, and for 2 hours, he'd remembered what it felt like to be Dr. Thompson instead of Mike the janitor. Dr. Chen found him at 6:30 a.m. Just as his shift was ending. He was in the supply room, organizing his equipment and preparing to clock out. She knocked on the open door and waited for him to acknowledge her presence. Your hand, he asked, noticing the neat bandaging, 12 stitches, no tendon damage. Just like you said. They stood in the small room surrounded by cleaning supplies and industrial equipment. 2 people trying to process what had happened between them and what it meant. I looked you up, Dr. Chen said finally. Dr. Michael Thompson. Cardiothoracic surgery. You graduated from Johns Hopkins, did your residency here, were chief resident in cardiac surgery. You developed 3 innovative procedures that are still in use today. You had papers published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Mike didn't respond, but he didn't deny it either. You left medicine 7 years ago, she continued. The records don't say why, just that you voluntarily surrendered your medical license and left the profession. Mike finished organizing his supplies and closed the cabinet door. That's correct. Why? The question hung between them, weighted with professional curiosity and human compassion. Mike had answered that question for therapists, for licensing boards, for the few friends who'd stayed in touch after his career ended. But he'd never answered it for a colleague who'd just witnessed him practice medicine again. Because I made a mistake, he said simply, and someone died because of it. Dr. Chen absorbed this information without judgment. In medicine, mistakes were an inevitable reality. The difference between doctors who continued practicing and those who didn't often came down to how they processed those mistakes, and whether they could find ways to learn and move forward. What kind of mistake? Mike leaned against the supply cabinet, suddenly feeling the weight of 5 years of silence. Routine mitral valve repair, 53-year-old father of 2. Everything went perfectly until the final suture placement. I was tired 28 hours into a shift that should have ended 12 hours earlier. My hand slipped. 1/4 of an inch. That's all, but it was enough to nick the left anterior descending artery. He paused, remembering details he replayed thousands of times in the years since. We caught it immediately, started repair procedures, called in vascular surgery. Did everything right, but the damage was done. He coded on the table. We got him back. But he'd suffered massive brain damage from the oxygen deprivation. He lived for 6 weeks in a vegetative state before his family made the decision to withdraw support. Dr. Chen listened without interrupting, recognizing the weight of confession in his words. The review board cleared me, Mike continued. Called it an acceptable complication of a complex procedure. No disciplinary action, no fault found. But I knew what had happened. I knew that a good man died because I was too proud to admit I was too tired to operate safely. So you quit medicine entirely? I surrendered my license, left the profession. Found work here because I couldn't quite bring myself to leave medicine completely. But I couldn't trust myself to practice it either. Double quotes. Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment, processing the story and its implications. When she spoke again, Her voice was gentle but direct. "What you did tonight, that was practicing medicine. And you saved Mrs. Vasquez's life." Mike nodded. "I know, and I don't know how I feel about that." "How long has it been since you've done clinical work?" 5 years, 3 months, 13 days. The precision of his answer told Dr. Chen everything. She needed to know about how much he'd missed it. "You were good tonight," she said. "Better than good. You saw things I missed. Made connections I wouldn't have made for another 10 minutes. Mrs. Vasquez is alive because you were there." Mike looked at her bandaged hand, then met her eyes. "Mrs. Vasquez is alive because you had the courage to ask for help and the skill to implement treatment recommendations. I just provided consultation. Is that what you tell yourself?" Mike didn't answer directly. Instead, he picked up his time card and prepared to clock out. "My shift's over. I need to get home." But Dr. Chen wasn't finished with the conversation. "What if I told you that tonight doesn't have to be an isolated incident?" Mike paused, his hand on the time clock. "What do you mean?" "I mean there might be ways for you to use your knowledge and experience to help patients without formally practicing medicine, consultation, education, research. Ways to contribute that don't require you to carry a license or take direct responsibility for patient care." It was a possibility Mike had never seriously considered for 5 years. He had seen his choice as binary: either practice medicine or abandon it completely. The idea that there might be a middle ground, a way to contribute without crossing the lines he'd drawn for himself, was both intriguing and terrifying. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Dr. Chen reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card. "My contact information. If you decide you want to explore some options, call me. No pressure, no timeline, just an open door." Mike took the card and looked at it for a moment. "Dr. Sarah Chen, cardiology resident, St. Mary's General Hospital." A simple business card that represented a bridge between the life he'd lost and the life he might still be able to build. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you," Dr. Chen replied, "for tonight, for Mrs. Vasquez, for reminding me that sometimes the most important knowledge comes from unexpected places." Mike's walk home that morning felt different than any of the previous 1,927 walks he'd taken from St. Mary's to his apartment. The streets looked the same: quiet residential blocks lined with small houses and aging apartment buildings. Early morning light filtering through trees that were just beginning to show their full colors. But something fundamental had shifted in Mike's relationship with the world around him. For the first time in 5 years, he'd practiced medicine, not in an official capacity, not with legal protection or institutional support, but meaningfully. He'd made clinical decisions that had directly impacted patient care, and those decisions had been correct. Mrs. Vasquez was alive and stable because he'd overcome 5 years of self-imposed exile to help when he was needed. As he climbed the stairs to his apartment, Mike found himself thinking about Dr. Chen's offer. Ways to contribute to medicine without formally practicing. It was an idea that challenged the rigid boundaries he'd established for himself. Boundaries that had provided safety and structure, but perhaps at the cost of denying who he fundamentally was. He made coffee and sat at a small table with Dr. Chen's business card. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future that included medicine in some form, not as Dr. Thompson, chief of cardiothoracic surgery, but as someone who could still contribute, still teach, still help heal, even if he couldn't hold a scalpel. The idea was both exciting and terrifying. Mike spent the day researching possibilities he'd never considered. Medical consulting firms that provided expertise to hospitals, and legal teams, educational programs that trained new surgeons and nurses, research institutions that developed new techniques and technologies, quality improvement initiatives that helped hospitals provide better patient care. Each possibility represented a different way of engaging with medicine. That didn't require him to take direct responsibility for patient outcomes. The responsibility that had crushed him when John Mitchell, the father of two, had died on his operating table 7 years ago. 3 days later, Mike made a decision that surprised him. He called Dr. Chen. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told her when she answered, "about ways to contribute without formally practicing. I'm glad you called. Have you had any specific thoughts about what might interest you? Education? Maybe. Training? Residents?" "I've been reading about simulation programs that help new surgeons practice complex procedures without risk to patients." Dr. Chen's excitement was audible in her voice. "That's perfect. St. Mary's is actually looking to expand their surgical simulation program. They need someone with advanced cardiac experience to help design training protocols. I don't have any teaching credentials. You have something better. You have real experience and deep knowledge. And after what I saw the other night, you have the ability to assess situations quickly and communicate clearly under pressure." Mike was quiet for a moment, processing the possibility. What would it involve? Let me make some calls. See what might be available. No commitments from you, just information gathering. I'd appreciate that. 2 weeks later, Mike found himself in a conference room at St. Mary's that he hadn't seen in 7 years. Dr. Patricia Hamilton, the hospital's director of medical education, had agreed to meet with him based on Dr. Chen's recommendation and his previous reputation at the hospital. "Dr. Chen tells me you're interested in contributing to our simulation program," Dr. Hamilton said after they'd exchanged introductory pleasantries. "I'm exploring possibilities," Mike replied carefully. "I'm not currently licensed to practice medicine, but I have experience that might be valuable in educational settings." Dr. Hamilton had clearly done her research. "Your background is impressive. chief resident in cardiac surgery, developer of the Thompson procedure, published researcher. May I ask why you left medicine? Mike had prepared for this question, but it was still difficult to answer. I made a clinical error that resulted in a patient death. The review board found no fault, but I lost confidence in my ability to practice safely. Dr. Hamilton nodded thoughtfully. That shows remarkable self-awareness and professional responsibility. Those are exactly the qualities we need in surgical education. She went on to explain the hospital's simulation program, which used high-tech mannequins and virtual reality systems to allow residents and nurses to practice complex procedures. In risk-free environments, the program was expanding, and they needed someone with advanced cardiac expertise to develop training scenarios and assess trainee performance. The position would be part-time, Dr. Hamilton explained, 20 hours per week. You'd work with residents and nurses, designing realistic cardiac emergency scenarios and providing feedback on their performance. No direct patient care, but significant impact on the quality of care our trainees will eventually provide. It was exactly what Mike hadn't known he was looking for. A way to use his medical knowledge and experience to help others learn and improve, without the responsibility that had overwhelmed him 7 years earlier. When would you need an answer? Mike asked. Take your time. This is a new position, and we want the right person. If you're interested, we can start with a trial period. See how it feels for both of us. Mike spent another week considering the offer. He talked to his old therapist, who encouraged him to view it as a positive step toward reintegration, rather than a betrayal of the boundaries he'd established. He researched the legal and professional implications, confirming that educational work didn't require medical licensure, as long as he wasn't providing direct patient care. Most importantly, he thought about Mrs. Vasquez, who had returned to Dr. Chen's office for follow-up care, and was doing well. Her life had been saved by medical knowledge he'd almost let atrophy in the name of self-protection. Mike accepted the position on a Monday morning in December. 5 years and for months after he'd last worked in medicine in any capacity, Dr. Hamilton introduced him to the simulation center staff and gave him a tour of facilities that were far more advanced than anything that had existed during his residency. The mannequins could simulate complex cardiac conditions with startling realism. Virtual reality systems allowed trainees to practice surgical procedures with haptic feedback that felt remarkably like real tissue. Computer programs could generate thousands of different emergency scenarios, each with unique challenges and learning opportunities. Mike's first assignment was to develop a training module for cardiac emergency response. Using his experience from the night with Mrs. Vasquez as a starting point, he created scenarios that would teach residents to recognize cardiogenic shock, make rapid treatment decisions, and coordinate care under pressure. Working with the simulation center's technical staff, Mike discovered that he had a natural talent for education. He could break down complex medical concepts into understandable components, design realistic training scenarios that challenged learners without overwhelming them, and provide feedback that was both honest and encouraging. His first training session was with a group of second-year residents, including Dr. Chen. Watching them work through the cardiac emergency simulation he designed, Mike felt something he hadn't experienced in years: professional fulfillment that didn't depend on life or death pressure. Dr. Thompson, one of the residents, said after the session, that scenario felt incredibly real. How did you make it so authentic? Mike smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn in a medical setting in over 5 years, because it was based on a real case. Every detail, every complication, every decision point came from actual experience. Whose case? Dr. Chen asked, though Mike suspected she already knew. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez. Mike replied, room 314, cardiac wing, about 6 weeks ago. The residents looked at him with new understanding. This wasn't just theoretical knowledge, this was wisdom earned through real practice, real successes and real failures over the following months. Mike developed a reputation as one of the most effective clinical educators at St. Mary's. His